Hey everybody, Thomas Joseph here, and today we are talking about steaks. Now, sometimes when you're in the supermarket or your local butcher shop, are you intimidated by the choices that you have in front of you? You don't know which cut to buy, what the differences are between all of them in front of you. Well, today I hope to share with you some different tips and tricks in making steaks at home, knowing the differences between the cuts, and whether you're eating at home or dining out, all of that information should help you. Today, I am focusing on two different cuts, two of my favorite cuts, and they're actually a little less expensive than some of those premium cuts in the supermarket. I have a skirt steak here, and then I also have a strip steak. Now, strip steak, depending on where you get it, can be a little bit pricey, but skirt steak is definitely a reasonable cut. So I'm gonna start with the skirt steak, and I'm sure you've seen this. It's become pretty available out there in the marketplace today, and skirt steak is a really interesting thin cut of meat that's from the abdominal region of the cow. And the one thing you need to know about skirt steak and its kind of cousin cuts, which are flank steak and hanger, is that it's a little bit more fibrous, and they're typically lean cuts. So the one thing that you have to be careful with is not overcooking these cuts of meat. Typically comes in these long pieces, and sometimes you might actually need to trim the steak a little bit because it does have this kind of fatty cap to it. This is actually nicely trimmed. You want to leave a little bit of fat on the cut here because you need something that's going to melt down and moisten the meat during the cooking process. Now, for me today, I want to cut this guy in half because I can't fit this whole long piece in my grill pan, but if you have an outdoor grill, you could certainly leave this in a nice long piece. Now, the one fantastic thing about skirt steak and flank steak and hanger steak is that it's particularly flavorful. It's quite beefy and robust. And so that means that it can pair really nicely with a marinade. Now, I'm using a really simple marinade today that has ingredients that you might have in your pantry and in your refrigerator. What this marinade does is it kind of adds an added element to the steak. It complements the beefiness in a really great way. So this is a generous 1/4 cup of Worcestershire sauce, which I feel like if you don't have this in your refrigerator, you guys really should. Worcestershire sauce is really fantastic in so many different ways. It's a good way to kind of amp up flavor because it is filled with so many wonderful savory ingredients. To this, I'm gonna add 3 tablespoons of chopped rosemary. Now, you could use another woodsy herb like thyme, even oregano could work here as well. I have 3 cloves of coarsely chopped garlic, and then a couple tablespoons of olive oil. And I'm gonna let this marinate for about 15 minutes, not really long at all, but you could certainly do this overnight. So just flip these guys in the marinade so they're nice and evenly coated, and lay this off to the side. And while this is marinating and getting gently perfumed with all of those wonderful flavors, I'm gonna start the strip steak. Strip steak is from the loin cut of the cow, and it's generally much more tender than something like a skirt steak, flank steak, or hanger steak. If you're a big fan of those porterhouse steaks, what's interesting is that the strip steak or the strip loin runs along one side of that T-bone. The other side is the fillet or the tenderloin, which is really, really tender, as the name suggests. But this other cut, this other side, is really flavorful. It's also pretty lean depending on how much marbling it has in it. Marbling is the amount of fat that runs through the meat itself, which is a desirable feature because it melts down during the cooking process and creates something that's tender and moist. Now, a strip steak can go by some other names. Sometimes it's called a Kansas City steak or a Manhattan steak. I really love this steak. Now, one thing you want to do is you want to, before you cook this guy, is patting it dry with a paper towel before you're ready to cook it. And this will ensure that you get a nice crisp crust, a nice caramelized edge around your steak. Now, another important thing to mention here, guys, is that you want your steaks to be not so cold before you cook them. One kind of common mistake is that people cook a lot of proteins, a lot of meats right out of the refrigerator, and what that does is it will overcook the outside of the meat that's in kind of direct contact with high heat, and it takes a lot longer for the inside to be cooked to your desired doneness. So I'm seasoning this guy with a little bit of salt and pepper. Be generous when you're seasoning. This is a little ground coriander, and I have a little bit of dried oregano here as well. So this seasoning blend that I'm using today is kind of a bit of a southwestern style seasoning. Whether you're using just salt and pepper or a seasoning blend, it really goes well with this type of meat. So I'm gonna add on this side a little bit of salt, pepper, the rest of my dried oregano, and the coriander. So now I'm gonna take this lovely steak and I'm gonna cook it in a cast iron skillet. Now this steak is about 1.5 inches, I would say, in thickness, and this is perfect because this steak will cook on the stovetop completely from start to finish. Now, if you have a thicker steak, if you have something that kind of goes north of 1.5 inches, you might want to start the steak out on the stovetop or on your grill, but you want to move it away from direct heat. Otherwise, it's going to burn on the outside before it has time to fully cook on the inside. And indirect heat, guys, as a reminder, is a lower heat. So you could do that in the oven, or if you're working with a grill, you could certainly put that to the cooler side of the grill to cook completely. So this steak here is gonna take about 2 to 3 minutes per side. You wanna make sure you brown it nice and evenly on all sides, including this kind of thin edge. So this is going into my skillet here, again, about 2 to 3 minutes per side. So while the strip steak is cooking here, I'm going to finish my skirt steak. So this has been going for about 15 minutes here, and I'm gonna remove it from the marinade. And then one important thing to do here is to remove as much of the marinade as possible. And this is especially important when you're using marinades that have a lot of sugar in them. So if you have an Asian marinade or something like a teriyaki marinade, you wanna remove it from the outside, because what's gonna happen is with all of that direct heat from the pan, it's going to caramelize to start. But with prolonged cooking, it's gonna burn, it's gonna stick. And sometimes with really wet marinades, what's gonna happen is you're gonna get steam, and it's not going to give you a beautiful brown crust. And then season these up with some salt and pepper. So as I mentioned before, skirt steak, flank steak, and hanger steak, they're actually pretty lean. They're tough cuts of meat. They're tough in a different way than like a shoulder or chuck would be, which is that shoulder portion of the meat that we typically use for braising and stewing. So the one thing is you want to cook them quickly, but you need to know the trick in how to cut them so that they have the perception of being really nice and tender. Salt, pepper, I have my grill pan over here heating to a nice medium-high heat. And I'm gonna grill the skirt steak for about 2 to 3 minutes per side. Now, it actually depends on how thick your skirt steak is. The one interesting thing about skirt steak is it kind of has a thinness to the edges, but then it gets thicker as the skirt of the steak progresses. So the center will be thicker like this piece here, but the edges will be a little thinner. So it really depends on the cut you buy in your supermarket. But this really is a nice quick cooking cut of meat. So 2 to 3 minutes on this side. And so for the strip steak, it's about 2 to 3 more minutes, and then we'll be ready to flip this guy. All right, so it's been about 3 minutes, and I'm going to flip this guy over, and look at that. It has a nice, beautiful brown crust. There are little bits of charred edges, which are really fantastic. And I'm gonna cook this for another 2 to 3 minutes until it reaches an internal temperature of about 120 degrees. 120 is ideal for rare to almost medium rare, which is my preference. But if you guys like your steaks a little bit more cooked, like medium, you could go north in temperature. All right, so our skirt steak over here it's been on the heat for about 3 minutes, and I'm gonna give it a good flip now. Oh, it has nice, beautiful grill marks. Again, part of the reason why is because we've removed a lot of the marinade, so it's not steaming with all of that liquid. That looks great. So this is gonna go a little bit further. Our strip steak over here is just about done. Now, as I mentioned before, I really wanna get the edges nice and brown too, so this is a tip that you should use whenever you're making steaks in your kitchen or on your grill. Just holding them up on their side so that the fat kind of renders a little bit and gets brown is really important in giving you a nice, beautiful, well-cooked steak that has a lot of flavor. I'm gonna turn this guy off, and I'm gonna transfer my strip steak here to a wire rack set over a rimmed baking sheet, and I'm gonna allow the steak to rest. Now, resting is really important whenever you're making a steak like this, a chop, even chicken cutlets or a roast chicken. It's really important to let your proteins kind of rest for this steak, about 5 minutes. It could even go to 10 minutes. For anything larger, you wanna give it a little bit more time. And what happens is it allows the juices to kind of reabsorb into the meat. When you cut it, they're not gonna rush out onto your board as they would if you cut this right off of the heat. So this is gonna rest while our skirt steak continues to cook here for about another 3 to 4 minutes. All right, so we're all done cooking, and I can't wait to slice into these delicious steaks here. Now this is the strip steak again. Just gonna slice into it. Now we took this to about 120 degrees, and you can see that it has a nice pink interior. So this is like, I would say medium rare, which is really fantastic for me, and that's what I like. And one of the things that I like to do whenever I'm serving steak is to slice it, but then also at the very end, before I put it on the table for everybody, give it a sprinkling of some coarse sea salt. And this is a nice flaky Maldon salt. Now, as I mentioned before, with a cut like this is strip steak. You could use a ribeye steak or a tenderloin. A nice pan sauce with all of those wonderful brown bits in the pan would be really nice to serve alongside this, or a wonderful flavorful compound butter, which we showed you guys how to make in a past episode. This looks really delicious. Now I think our skirt steak has rested just enough to slice. And here's the real trick with skirt steak, guys. You need to slice it against the grain. So what I'm gonna do is I have my knife, I'm almost perpendicular to the grains of the meat, to the fibers of the meat. And you should thinly slice skirt steak, flank steak, or hanger steak against the grain on a bias. And these are about, I would say, 1/4 inch slices. Skirt steak, you could serve it just like this. It's really fantastic with tacos. You could stir fry skirt steak. It's really delicious in that way as well. But the one thing that I really like is that you don't need to create a sauce for this guy because he's already been marinated, so it's really, really flavorful and delicious. The one thing I will add is a sprinkling of salt, as always. And there you have it, guys. I just demonstrated with 2 different cuts today, but don't be intimidated by your butcher case. Go in, try a different cut of meat, experiment and see what your preferences are. I hope I've encouraged you. Now, if you have any kitchen conundrums, any comments, reach out to us using the hashtag Kitchen Conundrums. We love to hear from you, and enjoy your steak, guys. And as always, guys, click like and subscribe.